There are more than 300 different types of phobias, and almost 10% of the world's population suffers from them in one form or another. Take Spheksophobia, for example. Spheksophobia is one of the more common phobias on the list. But what is Spheksophobia, you may ask? Simply put, Spheksophobia is the chronic and persistent fear of wasps. So how about you? Are you afraid of wasps? Do you or somebody you know have Spheksophobia? Well, what if I told you it was a wasp? Yes, a tiny little wasp that was responsible for the crash of an $80 million Boeing 757, claiming all 189 on board. How do you feel now? Did you suddenly develop a case of Spheksophobia? I know I did. But I can hear your questions over your sarcastic sighs. Come on, Maximus. Surely you exaggerate. How could an insect bring down a giant modern jet airliner? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you next on Maximus. Tuesday, February 6, 1996, had been a beautiful, balmy, tropical winter day in Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic. A group of German tourists now assembled at Gregorio Luperon International Airport were looking forward to bringing their wonderful new memories of their vacation in the Dominican Republic back home with them to Frankfurt, Germany. However, the flight schedule to take them home to Germany had been delayed due to mechanical problems. So the charter airline Alas Nationalis hurried to lease a replacement plane for the flight. The plane, a Boeing 757, was owned and operated by the Turkish charter company Birgenair. However, the aircraft hadn't flown in over 3 weeks. There was nothing mechanically wrong with the plane. It was parked at the airport simply because there were no flights scheduled for the aircraft. As a result of the plane sitting idle for so long, it took several hours to prepare the aircraft to get it ready to fly, which, as it turned out, was beneficial to the airline because it also took that long to round up the crew on such short notice so late in the evening. But finally, after a few hours, a crew was assembled and the plane was ready, and the anxious tourists finally boarded the plane. Around 11:30 p.m., Birgenair Flight 301 pulled away from the gate and taxied out to the runway to prepare for takeoff. During Flight 301's takeoff roll at 11:42 p.m., Captain Ahmet Erdem, Birgenair's most experienced and senior pilot, noticed that his airspeed indicator was malfunctioning, but he chose not to abort the takeoff. Instead, he relied on the first officer's airspeed indicator, which was functioning properly. Why the experienced captain didn't abort the takeoff as he was trained to do would come back to haunt everyone on board that night. The aircraft, call sign Alpha Lima Whiskey, took off normally at 11:42 p.m. At 2,500 feet, the flight was cleared to climb to flight level 280 or 28,000 feet. Then at 1 minute and 30 seconds into the flight, the autopilot was engaged. But almost immediately after the autopilot was engaged, the plane's nose pitched up sharply and alarms began to sound, indicating a problem with the rudder ratio and Mach speed trim. These are two separate alarms that warn the pilot that the plane is flying way too fast. But the first officer's airspeed indicator showed the plane was ascending normally at 220 knots. Then suddenly, the first officer's airspeed indicator showed they were rapidly losing airspeed, now under 200 knots and dropping. But at the same time, the captain's airspeed indicator showed them overspeeding at 325 knots. So the captain quickly came to the conclusion that both airspeed indicators must be wrong, and he told the relief pilot to reset the circuit breakers, hoping that would somehow solve the problem. But when the first circuit breaker was reset and silenced one alarm, suddenly now the overspeed warning sounded, and the captain's airspeed indicator showed that they were traveling at over 335 knots, which is the maximum speed the plane is designed to fly at that low altitude. However, resetting the circuit breakers may have silenced the alarms, but it didn't address the problem. The aircraft was still telling them they were flying way too fast. As the plane was climbing through 4,700 feet, the captain's airspeed indicator was displaying 350 knots or about 400 miles per hour. Finally, the confused but very experienced captain figured since the plane was apparently flying too fast, he decided the answer may be to reduce engine power. So that's what he did. But as soon as he did, the entire aircraft suddenly began to shake violently. As a result of the captain's decision to reduce power, that caused the autopilot to disconnect, immediately triggering the 757 stick shaker stall alert, warning the confused pilots that the aircraft was flying dangerously slow and about to stall. But as the plane began to stall, its path became unstable, and the plane pitched over and began to fall from the night sky. About 20 seconds before the crash, the captain finally attempted to recover from the stall, but it was too late. The left engine flamed out, causing the right engine, which was still at full power, to throw the aircraft into a flat spin. Moments later, the plane inverted. At 11:47 p.m., the ground proximity warning system sounded an audible warning, and 8 seconds later, the plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. All 176 passengers and 13 crew members were lost. But now it was time for the investigators to find out what could make this reliably safe Boeing 757 suddenly fall from the sky. Both data recorders as well as the aircraft wreckage was recovered from 7,200 feet on the ocean floor below. The black boxes were flown to Washington, D.C. and analyzed. It wasn't long before a picture of what happened on board Birgenair Flight 301 began to emerge. Investigators discovered that almost immediately after takeoff, the crew became overwhelmed by a series of warnings. Investigators were especially surprised how such an experienced captain could have become overwhelmed so quickly. They couldn't understand why the gauges on the captain's side of the plane weren't working properly, but on the right side of the plane, the first officer's gauges were working properly. But soon they made the connection and began to focus on the pitot tubes. Simply put, the pitot tube is an airspeed sensor. It's a hollow metal tube that relies on incoming air pressure as the plane flies to determine the aircraft's speed. But if the tube is somehow blocked, it will send misleading and faulty data to the pilots. So even though the aircraft is actually flying normally, the pilot's gauges will tell them differently, making them think the plane is actually flying slower or faster than it is. There have been major plane crashes in the past as a result of ice in the pitot tubes, and now investigators suspected the pitot tubes were blocked on the Birgenair Flight. However, there was no way they were blocked with ice, especially in such a warm tropical climate. It was at this point that the Dominican investigator came up with a theory. He knew the plane had been parked at the airport for weeks, so he thought the maintenance crews may have taped up the pitot tubes during maintenance and possibly forgot to remove the tape. But when they asked the maintenance crew, the maintenance supervisor told investigators they didn't service the aircraft at all, especially that they didn't do anything with the pitot tubes. It was then that the investigator asked the million-dollar question. Did you put the pitot tube covers on the aircraft? The answer he received stunned him. The maintenance chief said the plane didn't come with pitot tube covers, so they didn't put any covers on. It was then they realized that the 757 had sat idle for over 3 weeks with the pitot tubes exposed to the tropical elements. So now the investigators were convinced that it was blocked pitot tubes that brought down the plane. Still, the mystery remained. If not ice, then what could have blocked the pitot tubes on Birgenair Flight 301? Well, by now I'm sure you guessed. That's right, it was a WASP. None of the pitot tubes were ever recovered. However, investigators were convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that the culprit was the black and yellow mud dauber wasp. The mud dauber is a type of solitary wasp that builds its nest in artificial cylindrical structures or makes its own cylindrical nests out of mud, or in the case of Birgenair Flight 301, in the pitot tubes of a Boeing 757. Well, as legendary broadcaster Paul Harvey used to say, now you know the rest of the incredible true story of how a WASP brought down an $80 million Boeing 757. Well, that's going to do it for now. Hey, if you enjoy the channel and would like to support the work we do, please check out the Buy Me a Coffee app and merch links down below. But the best and always free way to support Maximus Aviation is to simply subscribe. As always, I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and on your way out, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. And remember, leave the rubber on the runway and your troubles on the ground. And I will see you next time in the air. Yeah, this is Maximus.